Welcome to all, far and wide, to today's webinar called Unpacking the Invisible, examining domestic and family violence in culturally diverse communities, delivered by SSI, so Settlement Services International, and hosted by Australia at Home. I'm Astrid Perry, Manager Strategic Policy at SSI, and I'll be guiding you through today's webinar. But before we move to the official welcome, there are just a few housekeeping sort of things to go through. We are recording this session, so it'll be uploaded later in the day. For those who haven't been to one of these events, they're designed to be relaxed, respectful, inclusive, a few things that help you to have the best experience. So we encourage you to keep your video on, as it does add to the sense of being together that Zoom enables, as opposed to some of the other platforms. If you are on a computer or laptop, you can set your screen to gallery view, and so you should see many of us together. There's also a chat function, so please use it to ask questions or make a comment, or feel free to introduce yourself there. There will be a 15 to 20 minutes Q&A at the conclusion of the panel. And so everyone's microphone is muted, and then the panel moderator will actually read out the questions that you've put into chat. It just helps with managing the time effectively. So please use the chat extensively. Yeah. So we encourage people to use their full name, and if you are representing an organization, then include your organization name as well. And you can rename yourself by clicking the 3 dots next to your own video on the screen. If you're having any technical issues, please private message the tech support person in the chat, and you find that Asfar has put her contact details there. And also, given the topic of today, we want to acknowledge that there are likely to be victim survivors of domestic and family violence, and that we fully understand if you need to leave the webinar. So please look after yourself, and remember you can ring 1-800-RESPECT for immediate over-the-phone counselling. All right? Okay. So with the preliminaries over, I'd like to introduce Violet Roumiliotis, CEO of SSI, Chief Executive Officer, who will provide the welcome address today. Welcome, Violet.
Thank you, Astrid, and good evening, everyone. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of which and waterways of which we are all meeting. For me, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who have cared for this land since time immemorial. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, as we move forward with reconciliation and renewal at its heart. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you on behalf of SSI to our long-awaited panel discussion, Unpacking the Invisible. We put together an exciting panel of specialists that will unpack and shed light on the complexity of domestic and family violence in multicultural and migrant communities. The panel will also discuss topics that are at the forefront of service providers' mind, who work alongside culturally and linguistically diverse communities and policymakers. I'd like to thank our panelists, absolutely wonderful, extraordinary women and leaders, our facilitator for being part of today's discussion. And I did want to acknowledge my wonderful colleagues, in particular, Astrid Perry and Juliana Nkrumah, who have been absolute champions and pioneers in SSI on this very important topic. I'd also like to especially thank our event hosts, Australia at Home, for making this event possible during these extraordinary times. I'm sure today's panel will give you much food for thought. I encourage you in the audience to post questions to the panel to enrich the conversation. For those of you who don't know, SSI is a community organisation providing settlement and social services support to some of Australia's most vulnerable individuals and communities. What we have seen in recent times during COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly once restrictions eased, is an increased demand on settlement services to support clients in very difficult domestic and family violence situations. SSI started advocating in this space some years ago as we began to see an increase in the rates of domestic and family violence amongst our own participant groups. We noted that there was limited services available to effectively work with migrant communities beyond collaboration with other like-minded organisations. These services and organisations, however, are not funded to undertake domestic and family violence work, but are forced to do so as trusted organisations. This often means that participants may be hesitant in accepting a referral to the organisation. They feel that the organisation doesn't have capacity to effectively support the needs of their needs, but also the organisation doesn't have the capacity to meet the needs of the participant. This applies particularly to newcomers, with many settlement services reporting that they are overwhelmed by the need for domestic and family violence support. Accordingly, SSI in the past few years has coordinated a community of practice with settlement and domestic and family violence, delivered men's behaviour change programs in language and in culture together with Relationships Australia, presented in a number of webinars around primary prevention and intersectionality, been awarded an Australian Research Centre grant together with the University of Wollongong to test accessibility of domestic and family violence screening in refugee programs, and received a Westpac grant recently to educate newly arrived fathers on parenting in Australia, the child protection system and domestic and family violence. It's a critical program. It's also important to acknowledge those who have worked tirelessly to support migrant women, both in multicultural and specialist domestic and family violence services. We know the system is stretched and we share your pain. I would like to acknowledge the work of Sister Maha Abdo from the Muslim Women's Association, who heads an organisation that is committed to supporting migrant women in a domestic and family violence situation. We thank her for outstanding leadership and wisdom in this space. I now would like to introduce the Honourable Mark Speakman, Attorney General of New South Wales and Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. I'm fortunate enough to be a member of the New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence Sexual Assault Council, which is shared by the Minister. I can assure you that the Minister is very invested in his portfolio of preventing domestic and family violence and spearheading a number of initiatives that are much appreciated. I can also assure you that he is an active listener and sits through long meetings without speaking and listens to what the Council has to offer. It's quite an extraordinary and rare attribute, I would say. So, Minister, welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Violet. Could I begin by acknowledging that from whichever part of New South Wales we gather this evening, we meet on Aboriginal land, and I'm on Gadigal land tonight. I'm actually at Parliament House. I think my colleague Trish Doyle is here as well. We may have to depart from time to time as the bells ring, but we'll be with you as much as we can. And in this NAIDOC week, I particularly welcome our Aboriginal colleagues who are with us today. Look, 2020 has been a challenging year for all of us, but no more so than for frontline workers and organisations that you work for. COVID's had a disproportionate impact on women as they picked up the extra load of family care during lockdown, the unexpected burden or joy of homeschooling. Women have also been at the front line of our health, education and essential services responses. This sector is full of dedicated people like you who work tirelessly with both victims, survivors and perpetrators to respond to domestic and family violence. The impact of domestic violence on women is profound and long-lasting, but we know that its impact on women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds is disproportionate and it's nuanced. And if you're a woman on a temporary visa, the impact on wellbeing and safety is even more profound. Even before their ability to receive services in a culturally and linguistically appropriate ways, having established social networks, access to long-term safe and affordable housing, access to legal services, financial support, pathways to employment, all these present great challenges. The safety of women on temporary protection visas is an issue that I've raised consistently with my Commonwealth colleagues because most of those issues are within the Commonwealth jurisdiction, and I'll continue to raise these issues at COAG fora that I attend. We know that women on temporary visas are less likely to seek police help because of fear of repercussions, from either their abusing partner or for the security of their visa status. We know that health services are a trusted source of assistance. So in August here in New South Wales, we changed our hospital fees policy so that free hospital treatment is available to everyone, regardless of their visa status, without requiring a police report. I think this is a small, but it's an important reform to remove a significant barrier to the wellbeing and safety of temporary visa holders and ensures immediate medical support is available and accessible when needed most. COVID has been particularly challenging for women from diverse backgrounds. The stay at home to stay safe message earlier on in the pandemic placed a number of women in a precarious situation because home is not always the safe place it ought to be. We know from the Australian Institute of Criminology report in July that there'd been an increase in domestic violence during the pandemic, and over 10% of victims reported that it was the first time their partner had been violent towards them. So look, many of you have moved very quickly to adapt to these changed circumstances, but your ability to adapt isn't shared across the community necessarily. Access to affordable and safely accessed technology has been a problem for some, exacerbated for those who may not have a strong command of English. And for homeschooling parents, this can open a social, generational, technological divide, and one that's not easily navigated. I hope that some of the stimulus packages that have been directed to the sector have helped. That's included over $6 million for emergency relief for asylum seekers and for specialist migrant and settlement NGOs. We've run a couple of campaigns to ensure continuity and accessibility of service for those who need help during COVID. One of those was Crime Stoppers, to encourage bystanders to report domestic violence to police in circumstances where they witness it or fear it in their own neighbourhoods. The second was our Speak Out campaign. This did focus on diversity, reminding people that the domestic violence line was accessible in languages other than English. We saw posters, social media, radio ads in different community languages, encouraging women to contact the DV line. And that's a crucial service helping victims who need a safety plan or to find accommodation or need information and advice. We put posters in a number of shopping centres, within bathrooms, near supermarkets and pharmacies, hospitals, local GPs, selected hotels, all in places designed to be where women could feel safe to make immediate contact, or they could save the DV line number to make a contact at a more appropriate time. We know that domestic and family violence doesn't discriminate and can impact women from all cultural backgrounds, all ages, but we know that the ability to access help is not equal for all women. So the Speak Out campaign has reflected this through the representation of women from diverse backgrounds. We're starting 2 new programs to help people to whom victims may disclose their experiences of violence, hairdressers and religious leaders. That's to ensure they fully understand the issues being disclosed to them and can make appropriate referrals to support services. It's that initial response to disclosures of violence that can significantly affect the outcome for victims. We've released a discussion paper recently on coercive control, following a recommendation of the Domestic Violence Death Review Team, similar legislative reform overseas, and a lot of discussion within the local sector about the possibility of reform in New South Wales. We're talking about what many victims report as the totality of domestic abuse, the ongoing patterns of psychological and physical abuse occurring within a family setting, as opposed to one-off incidents of abuse that are regularly the subject of police intervention or court intervention. We've got a parliamentary joint select committee going, which will gather evidence, give a range of stakeholders, everyone here, the chance to advise on potential reform, including how we might appropriately draft an offence in New South Wales, and more importantly than that, how it would be best operated and implemented in New South Wales. So look, I encourage you all to review that discussion paper, contribute your voice, your knowledge, your insights and recommendations to that inquiry. Going through Parliament at the moment, we've got some legal reforms to give domestic violence complainants better protection in court, with a presumption for closed courts and a presumption that evidence can be given remotely by audio-visual link in criminal cases and related ADVO cases. We've tightened up controls on animal abuse as a form of intimidation. and I'll have more to say in this area very soon. So look, thanks everyone for your advocacy, your dedication, your devotion, your diligence in this really difficult time, and all you do night and day for among the most vulnerable in our community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Violet and Minister Speakman. Violet, for your lovely welcome to SSI and background to our domestic and family violence work. Much has been achieved and hopefully there's more to come. A heartfelt thank you to you, Minister Speakman, Attorney General of New South Wales. It is very kind of you to make time for this event at the end of a busy day, and it sounds like you're going to be busy, I don't know how long tonight. It is quite clear that you are passionate about domestic and family violence and that you will do your utmost to move things forward, which is great. We appreciate anything you do that will benefit culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce Nikola Berkowitz, who will moderate our panel discussion and the Q&A session. Nicola Berkovic is the Legal Affairs Correspondent of The Australian, and we're very privileged to have her here today. She has been a reporter at the newspaper since 2007 and is the recipient of several awards, including the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery's Journalist of the Year in 2010, a New South Wales Kennedy Award for court reporting, and most importantly, Nicola also has received an Our Watch Award, administered by the Walkley Foundation for reporting on domestic violence. You would all agree with me that Nicola is very well equipped to moderate this panel. Welcome, Nicola.
Thank you so much. Well, we're actually just so lucky to have the most fantastic panel here tonight, who knows so much about the barriers that culturally diverse women face to seeking help. So I'll introduce them quickly because I want everyone to be able to hear what they have to say. Amani Haider is an artist, a lawyer and a writer whose mum, Salwa, was sadly killed by her father in 2015 at the age of just 45. Her father was found guilty of her murder. Amani is now a strong community advocate and an active board member of women's organisations. Dr. Heather Nancaro is the CEO of the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, otherwise known as ANROS, which is the only body in Australia dedicated to researching violence against women and children so that we can have a strong evidence base for policy in this area. Heather has been a passionate and committed DV advocate for over 35 years. Juliana Nkrumah AM is the Domestic and Family Violence Project Manager at SSI. She has helped to lead New South Wales and Australia's work on female genital mutilation, has received awards for her work with migrant women, and is a passionate advocate for African women in Australia. Maria Demopoulos AM is the former chair of the Harmony Alliance Migrant and Refugee Women for Change. She is internationally recognised as an expert in the intersections of diversity, gender equality and the law. She has advised governments and communities on domestic and family violence for decades. Pallavi Sinha is a multi-award-winning lawyer and academic who has been involved in state and federal government DV campaigns. She has represented survivors of abuse over many years and her opinion pieces have been widely published. I can't wait to ask you all some questions, but first we're going to let each of you speak for 2 minutes about our topic, Unpacking the Invisible, Examining Domestic and Family Violence in Culturally Diverse Communities. I'll hand over to you, Amani.
There we go. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm zooming in from, the Darug people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I recognise that a lot of my work delves into issues relating to displacement and trauma, and I'm cognizant of the displacement and trauma that has taken place on this land. So as you mentioned in your introduction, I come to this conversation from a awful lived experience of losing my mum to domestic violence in 2015. and the flow-on repercussions of that, a lot of which were invisible to the wider world. Her experience had elements that were invisible, and so did ours subsequent to her death and going through the legal process that followed. Some of that left us feeling quite, and my sisters and I feeling quite powerless in the system, where the conversation was dominated by headlines rather than by experiences that really highlighted what my mum had gone through, or that empowered us to speak up about our own perspectives. So for me, the challenge has been reclaiming some of that power and telling that narrative in my own way. And I'm a volunteer board member at the Bankstown Women's Health Centre, where services are provided in a really holistic way, and where the nuances of the culturally diverse community that we operate in are recognised and responded to, so that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and women are empowered to make choices and navigate their exit from a violent relationship in a way that's empowering to them. So for me, the important thing to highlight in any discussion is having that intersectional approach front of mind, empowering survivors and victims, and centering their experiences in a way that is allows solutions to be community-led and built from the ground up.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening with you. I want to thank SSI for the invitation. I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and would like to pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past and present, across the country where we're gathering today. So ANROSE, as Nicola has mentioned, is focused on producing an evidence base to support the development of policy and practice design in Australia for preventing and responding to violence against women and their children. In one of the first major pieces of work that ANROSE did in regard to women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds was looking at the gaps in data and how to improve data for the production of evidence to support policy and practice. Interestingly, that the name of that report, similar to the name of this webinar, was Invisible Women, Invisible Violence: Understanding and Improving Data on the Experiences of Domestic and Family Violence and Sexual Assault for Diverse Groups of Women. And so, you know, of course, it's very difficult to produce an evidence base if you don't have good quality data. So it's very important for us here at ANROSE to have drawn attention to the importance of improving data sources to ensure that we're inclusive of the experiences and needs of women from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds and their children, and also, of course, the men in those communities who also need to access services related to the prevention of violence against women, or responding to the perpetration of violence against women in particular. Amani's mentioned the importance of intersectionality, and for those of you who are not so familiar with that term, essentially what we're recognising is that gender inequality is a primary driver of violence against women, but gender doesn't exist in isolation from other dimensions of people's lived experience and identity. And it's really important that we understand that gender and other dimensions of identity intersect simultaneously in ways that create people's experiences of a phenomenon, including experiences of violence, but also in the way that they experience responses to that violence. ANROSE has undertaken to produce a number of research reports that address this, but I think more fundamentally, one of the things that I wanted to draw to your attention this evening is that recently, on the 20th of October, we launched Australia's National Research Agenda to reduce violence against women and their children for 2020 to 2022. And the purpose of that is not only to inform our own work, but also to encourage other researchers and research funders to focus on priority areas for the development of research, the development of an evidence base for policy and practice. And whilst we've identified 5 priority topics, we have constructed the ANRA, Australia's National Research Agenda, within the context of an overarching intersectional framework, so that any research that's done to produce evidence to prevent or respond to violence against women needs to be cognizant, as Amani says, of the intersections of various forms of discrimination and marginalisation in women's lives. We recently closed applications for a pending grant round. We're focusing in that grant round on children and young people in marginalised populations. We've received 57 applications for those grants, and we look forward to announcing a new ANROS program of research with an intersectional focus, particularly targeting research or building evidence to support children and young people dealing with domestic and family violence and sexual violence against their carers, their mothers, the women in their lives. So thanks once again for the opportunity to be here with you.
So thank you, Amani and Heather. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the Darug Nation, the Guringa people, from where I'm coming to you to this. You know, when we at SSI thought about this topic for the speaker series 2 years ago, there was a great deal of invisibility around the issues of domestic and family violence in CULT communities. 2 years ago, CULT communities were not in the frame, and there was very little information about them. The evidence was very scant and still is. And so no one paid much attention to the anecdote. When you can't see it, then it's not in the frame. When it's not in the frame, then you can't see it. So says Crenshaw. Yet DV exists in the CULT communities, and domestic homicide is probably about 46% of for the CULT communities and for CULT women. Yet services have been mainly in the mainstream. And when you hear statements like government has funded mainstream services and everyone has access to it, it almost becomes something like an insult. Then when you really think about it, you ask yourself the question, what about the barriers? What about the barriers for CULT women? The complexities around CULT and domestic and family violence are massive, one of which is language. And we don't mean language as in English language or ability to speak English. What we mean is the terminologies. What we mean are the paradigms that are within the sector, the domestic and family violence discourse and dialogue and narratives. These paradigms include intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence is not necessarily what happens to every CULT woman who suffers domestic and family violence. In actual fact, there is more violence in family, there is more violence between in-laws, there is more violence within the community putting pressure on women than there might be intimate partner violence. So those are the paradigms that we want to think about when we look at CULT communities as well, and to move away from the existing paradigms and look between that, in between that, for the complexities that CULT communities undergo. I want to also draw our attention to the issue of gender equality, which we know and we are told are the drivers of domestic and family violence. But in CULT communities, what does it really mean? How does that translate in language? Oughtn't we be looking at gender equity, which is probably a more easily accessible access to the issue of gender equality than gender equality itself, which brings up walls in the communities? And then let me say, COVID-19 has probably assisted in bringing CULT women victims into the picture. But I bet to say, we just scraped the surface. And for that matter, I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Juliana always has a way of pinching everything I'm about to say. Thanks, Juliana. Look, if I too could start by acknowledging 40, 50, 60,000 years of ownership and custodianship of this land. It's of course NAIDOC week, always was, always will be. lots of unfinished business, I think, for Multicultural Australia in terms of recognising the ongoing benefits of the colonisation and dispossession of this land. And I encourage us, when we're thinking about violence, the violence against the First Nations people is something that should be at the core of all of our work. So I want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Bunurong and that I continue to benefit from the disposition of their land. 2 minutes for an Australian woman of Greek Macedonian heritage is extremely challenging, particularly in light of what all of these amazing women have said so far. And I'm looking forward, Nicola, to the debate and conversation, because of course another part of my heritage is deeply Socratic. So we like a good bloody argument. And I think that's the point really around language and discussion, that we haven't interrogated these frameworks in 2020 in a way that still means that I have to feel frustrated every time I use the word culturally and linguistically diverse, that I have to wonder what the heck that word really means, that I have to be deeply concerned about its homogenising effect on the diversity that characterises this group called culturally and linguistically diverse, that each time I turn up to meetings on the issue of violence against culturally and linguistically diverse women, that I ask for the data and I ask for categories of meaningful data, and I ask for definitions around words like culture, ethnicity, and so on. And that indeed there's very little that is offered in response to those questions. That when we use culture and ethnicity as if they are synonymous, as if they are similar terms, then we are effectively prohibited from having open, honest, transparent conversations about the role of culture in our lives and the way in which racism and structural disempowerment of migrant and refugee women operate. That when we persist in only locating these forms of violence through a cultural lens, then we resort to things like vulnerability analysis. And what I'm hoping of all of our panellists tonight is that while I understand what we mean when we say migrant and refugee women are rendered more vulnerable by virtue of all of these barriers, they're rendered more vulnerable by virtue of their previous experience prior to arrival. I understand what we mean, but I also caution that that vulnerability analysis that isn't done in a way that intersectionality as a genuine framework for understanding power and structural discrimination against women and children, then we simply reinforce stereotypes and we end up resorting to patronising ways of responding to the lived experience of migrant refugee women. So what's my passion, Nicola? I'm hoping that we start to really interrogate, to start dispensing with the tendency to simply homogenise or put whole groups of women into one category. Because as a white European woman, I say to my sisters, women of colour, it is women like I too that have to take a deep look at the racism that we demonstrate on a daily basis towards our sisters of colour out there. Time for a transparent, open, honest conversation that moves away from simply using culture as the most meaningful way to understand the experiences of violence when we should be looking at power. Thank you.
Well, what an amazing speaker to follow. Really like to thank Settlement Services International for organising such an esteemed panel and for inviting me to speak. It's a huge privilege to be joining the webinar today, and thanks to everyone who's joining, because it is this collaborative approach of having all of us here together, and I'm looking forward to the interactive Q&A later on as well. That's what really is important in terms of finding solutions. And it's such an important topic. On NIDOC week, I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And as Maria mentioned, it is so important to highlight the acute nature of the domestic violence that's experienced by the Indigenous community, especially during NIDOC week. I'd also like to really also reiterate the point and emphasise that domestic or family violence can occur irrespective of gender, age, ethnicity and other factors such as your socioeconomic background. Clearly today we are focusing on migrant and refugee women and how it is experienced by them. But as Maria mentioned also, it is important not to then put anyone in a box. I think it's important to just be aware that it is an issue that is experienced by many, and then maybe look at the way in which it could be experienced by particular groups. So I've actually been an advocate in that area for a long time. When I was the Women's Committee Advisory Chair of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council Australia a few years ago, I presented submissions on behalf of FECA to the Senate Standing Committee on Domestic Violence at the time. And one of our recommendations that was accepted was to get disaggregated data. That is data that is specific to CALD, as in culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Because unless and until we have that data, it is really difficult to inform tailored and appropriate solutions for communities. And that could also extend to the other factors that I mentioned earlier. I've also been involved as Principal of Lawyers with Solutions. I'm a lawyer. I have represented survivors of domestic and family violence. So I've seen what it is like for women who are having to almost not experience the whole thing again, but having to tell the story or talk about domestic and family violence. I mean, I certainly applaud some of the reforms that have been made, but it is good that we have this opportunity now to talk more about what needs to be done to take it a step further. I've also been quite involved at the policy level, and that's another area I'm particularly interested in. A few years ago, I worked with community groups and we successfully advocated for changes to migration policy in the area of domestic violence, which would provide greater access to justice for domestic violence survivors. I was also involved with Department of Social Services on checklists that are drafted for new arrivals and to provide education to people who are coming here, because sometimes CALD communities, people from CALD communities may be coming from countries where they don't know about this concept of domestic violence, or they're not encouraged, or there's a stigma involved in speaking up about it. And that's another thing that I would also like to highlight, having had that experience as an immigration lawyer. I've certainly seen this topical concept of coercive control, which the Attorney General mentioned as a discussion paper about, but I've seen it quite acutely in that there can be a pattern of domination and control exercised by a partner who's brought a spouse here from another country and then threatens to send that spouse back to the country that they came from if they do not agree to the sponsor's demands. And this can be a pattern of demands and pattern of control that can happen from the date of the sponsorship for a very long period of time, which is why this whole discussion around pattern of behaviour, I think, is even more important. And in terms of the invisibility, I mean, that's the whole thing. We are working in the space to try to make sure that CALD communities understand what domestic or family violence is. But I still am amazed to hear, as of today, and I'm sure there are still people who don't realise that domestic and family violence extends beyond physical violence. I do recall reading about the Hannah Clark case in Queensland and her family not understanding that, for example, domestic violence can include the sort of coercive behaviour that her partner had been exhibiting towards her. The other problem of invisibility with CALD cultures can be this stigma and normalisation of shame, that if somebody speaks up and talks about the family violence or domestic violence, which could be from an extended family perspective or from their partner, there's not approval of them talking about it. In fact, there could be some community leaders who even silence them from talking about it. And there's also the issue of domestic violence within CALD communities and between CALD communities. So when I talk about within a CALD community, for example, there could be a particular notion such as caste, and that is misused, and there's a backward manifestation where then a person from a particular caste thinks they are superior to a person from another caste and attempt to exercise power and control and violence for that reason. It can also be between communities where one called community thinks, well, we're better than the other called community, and if there has been an interracial marriage, that may extend on to the marriage. But these are all very complex areas. There are also, again, culturally specific issues that could come up, such as dowry abuse in the context of domestic and family violence. But it is difficult within, you know, the short period of time to talk about them adequately, and I've tried to do what I can. I'm very happy to answer or talk more and discuss matters as this excellent webinar continues.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. And we're certainly not shying away from the tough topics here tonight. I'm going to kick off our panel discussion, and also everyone in the audience, feel free to message us your questions, and hopefully we're going to have time at the end for some of those questions to be put to our panelists. Heather, I was going to start out by asking a question to you. We've heard a fair bit tonight about the lack of data. I'm always surprised when I write my articles about the lack of data sometimes in that you can find to tell us about the nature and the levels of violence that particular communities face. But at the same time, there's a concern about labelling certain groups or, you know, painting certain community groups in a bad light. How do you balance the need to research what is happening in a specific community, call out violence in a specific community, and tailor our response without stereotyping or painting certain communities in a bad light?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Nicola, and it is one that we grapple with, and particularly I think perhaps one of the best examples of that is when we had the results of the 2017 National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women survey, and we have the number of reports on subsamples of the overall Australian population, and one of those subsamples is a sample of people from non-main English speaking backgrounds or non-main English speaking countries who are identified in the biggest sample. And it is, you know, we are very mindful that the results of that report on that subsample can lead to discrimination or increased discrimination, can lead to stigmatisation, can lead to, you know, people perhaps then not feeling able to report or do anything about the experiences of violence, you know, so it is troubling about how to manage that. So what I think the value of the National Community Attitude Survey is, I mean, it shows that we're making progress overall in terms of attitudes are improving, and overall most Australians, including most people from non-main English speaking countries, most of those people reject violence against women. So the vast majority understand the nature of domestic violence and hold attitudes that are not supportive of violence against women. But we do have to focus to some extent on those who do have problematic knowledge and attitudes, because the value of the NCAS is that it gives us direction for where we need to put effort into prevention work. And so we do need to be able to identify communities where there is need for greater effort across the country. Otherwise, we potentially risk improving the situation for women who are not from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds and leaving them behind. So it's really important that we get the message out. So the way we managed that in particular was to have, instead of a very big open launch, we had a more targeted communication strategy around the release of that report, and engaged with the stakeholders who are in a position to be able to respond to the results of that survey more directly. So we've just engaged with those groups. And Nicola, I do want to thank you for your coverage in The Australian of that particular report and the sensitivity to which you treated the results of those findings. And so we also need to be able to get the message out more widely. but in the hands of capable, sensitive journalists who can do that for us. So I guess it's, there are perhaps many things to be said about that, but that, just to reassure you, I guess, that ANROS is very aware of the sensitivities and you put a lot of thought and effort into and consult with people working in this field to help us develop a communication strategy that's not going to do any harm.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now. We've touched on briefly here this idea of community and family shame. Amani, I was wondering if you can reflect for us how the way that shame or, being worried about being cut off from your own community can stop some women from seeking help or from leaving a violent or abusive relationship.
I think shame is a huge component of all kinds of patriarchal violence, and I think it is one of the most devastating tools that patriarchy uses to not just inflict harm, but then silence women about the harm that they've experienced and prevent them from taking their story and advocating for change with it. So in my personal experience, the way that manifested was in relation, firstly, to my mum's personal journey, where she felt shame around issues of, being a woman whose marriage might be perceived to have failed, disclosing that to other people when you're expected to hold together a family and be a great mother and be excellent in all the different areas of your life. That was a great source of shame for her that prevented her from, making disclosures to other people and held her back from empowering herself at certain stages of her life. There was also a shame that was linked with the things that we've touched on already, the racial stereotypes that exist in our society. And there is some evidence to suggest that one of the reasons that Muslim women might underreport violence is a fear of feeding back into unfair stereotypes and having their unique experience just sort of slotted in with that stereotype and not actually dealt with properly or sensitively. So there was an element of that. Then moving into my own experience after losing mum, wanting to advocate on her behalf, wanting to participate in the process meaningfully, the shaming took on a different form and started coming from people who were invested in maintaining the saving face, protecting the reputation of my dad's family, people who felt that creating a facade of unity was more important than pursuing justice. And sometimes that shaming can also take place with within spiritual vernacular, and depending on the different religious community that you're looking at, takes a form that then shames you either as a woman seeking divorce or as a daughter who's speaking out in a way that's unfavorable to the family, as a child who's challenging their parents, as someone who's being too outspoken in the public space. So shame operated through my experience at different stages in different ways, and really required me to sort of think about, well, how do I confront that and push it aside when I actually have quite limited resources, when I don't know exactly who to go to, who to trust in the media, what's going to happen with my dad's trial, and all of those different factors in very subtle ways kept me feeling very silenced through that experience, and were things that I had to gradually overcome. And I think there's another element that's important, and linking to, I spent the morning in a workshop about men's behaviour change, and I think shame plays a role there too. So if shame can hold men back from actually pursuing that support and that help, and that's compounded by a lack of access to culturally sensitive or even culturally community-led initiatives. So feeling ashamed about their, behavior, or the fact that they're struggling to maintain control and power over the people in their family, especially their partner, and shame in relation to what other people will say about them and that lack of power that they perceive themselves to have. So I think it's really important to bear in mind that this shame comes from kind of takes place in a sort of different way in collectivist communities, and not to always think of domestic violence as an individualized incident or crime, and extend it to, well, what does this person's context then do after the event or before the event to prevent them from putting that shame aside and seeking the appropriate help, and how do we facilitate that process?
Thank you. I'm going to now move on to another topic, which we heard from the Attorney General this evening, that he's thinking about, and he's launched an inquiry into coercive control laws. We know that in almost every single domestic homicide that has been reviewed in our state, that this pattern of controlling what a person can wear, what their finances, who they're allowed to have relationships with, who their friends are, that this is a pattern in almost every domestic homicide that we've seen. And obviously there's a live question about whether that sort of pattern of behaviour should be criminalised or not. Pallavi, I'm wondering what you think about legislating for this sort of behaviour, and whether you think this will be an answer, or whether there's other things we need to be considering.
I think that's an excellent question, and I'm really pleased that the New South Wales Government has released a discussion paper, because it is a complex area and it is something that's important to do in a well thought out, researched and appropriate way. The legislation in New South Wales, there are two key pieces of legislation. They don't seem to cover patterns of behaviour, which is why coercive control and bringing in some sort of a definition of that into the New South Wales legislation, if it's done in an appropriate way, in my view, would be a good thing. From my understanding and looking at the discussion paper, I can't say I've read every single one of the 75 pages as much as I'd like to, but I've certainly looked at it. And I think that the Scotland example of legislation, the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act of 2018, which refers to a course of behaviour. I think that if it is thought through as to how New South Wales may reflect those sort of provisions in an appropriate way, I think it would be very effective, because as we all know, the law sets the standards for what is acceptable and is not acceptable. And there is a potential gap at the moment in terms of this pattern of behaviour. So, you know, for example, I did mention that Hannah Clark case, and the Hannah Clark case is also referred to in the discussion paper the New South Wales Government has released. And it is those sort of patterns of coercion, of monitoring, of depriving liberty, of, you know, the unique examples I provided in relation to called communities, where it could be domination, that control that starts from the minute that a person sponsors a spouse to come here to Australia, and they use that as a form of power that they keep exerting over them, that I got you your ticket to Australia, I've got you entry here, and if you don't accede to my demands, then I will ship you back. And a lot of women who come here don't want to go back, don't want to face any stigma or shame that they may experience if they go back as a divorced woman. And there is this pattern of coercive control that can happen right from the beginning of a marriage. So yeah, I'm definitely supportive of it, but I think it's really good that it's being done in a measured way, with the discussion paper being released by the government, and all community groups, lived experience, survivors, organisations like Settlement Services International and many of the groups who are present here today, being able to provide submissions and input into what that legislation might look like.
Thank you. There's a huge problem in this area in that in terms of funding, and obviously I'm sure most advocates in this area will talk about their stretched resources. There was a report that was recently published that identified the huge contribution that migration and settlement services can have in addressing domestic violence. And yet these settlement services, and with their bilingual workers, are only funded for the settlement side of their services, but they can be the first port of call for many migrant and refugee women. Maria, do you see this funding issue as a problem?
Oh, not at all. Funding's never a problem, Nicola. I think we've got adequate resourcing across the board. We're very happy with funding. Thank you very much. Funding is notoriously problematic in this sector for all of us, as I think we understand and know. And Nicola, I wouldn't mind sort of drawing Juliana in as somebody who does work at the forefront of settlement services here. But I do want to say a couple of preliminary points, if I can, about this question of referral pathways or the system's response to help-seeking behaviour or to women and children who are needing support across the whole continuum of violence against women and children. Firstly, we talk about invisibility. I think invisibility is a process and often a deliberate one. And in terms of making invisible, rendering women invisible, the work that so many community women do within their own respective networks on a daily basis to reach out to other women, to try and give voice to those women that are not able for a whole range of reasons, those activists out there who desperately seek out most effective ways of getting the sort of support that they need, both for themselves or for the women and children that they work with. So I want to pay my deepest, sincerest respect to that grind on a daily basis that I know so many women out there and men who very rarely get any acknowledgement, who won't feature in any report, who won't get named in any way, but who are an active part of that community response to family and domestic violence. The other two things that I want to say is that there is a reason why we have specialist services as part of the system's response. And that is, as Heather said earlier on, there has been a lot of investment, and rightly so, in ensuring that there's an evidence base to the kinds of diversity of responses that the family violence sector has developed over the many years that Heather and I and others on this panel have been involved in. And the problem is, though, that they too are often either not funded sufficiently, or when we look across the states, there are regional disparities, there are geographical kind of problems in terms of, access and so on. So there's no question that particularly for newly arrived migrant refugee women, the settlement sector has provided a critical frontline response to being able to recognise and respond to the existence of family and domestic violence in ways that are often responsive, that understand the nuances, that recognise the complexities that feature. And I think that the report, in acknowledging that role, has played a significant part in moving and progressing that discussion around what does a family violence service system response look like. Because I think to date, there are elements of it that have been rendered invisible, that have been made invisible. And so the wealth of that contribution has not been adequately acknowledged. At the same time, while we argue rightly for proper funding and resourcing, because the settlement services are doing it anyway, Juliana, they are responding to disclosures, they're just not funded to do it. At the same time, though, I think we need to ensure that at no point do we lose sight of human rights frameworks around the primacy of safety, around the rights of everybody to live free and safe from violence, that we don't inadvertently lapse into thinking, oh yes, the settlement sector as opposed to the specialist family violence sector, and we start getting a hierarchicalising of responses. So any coward woman therefore gets channeled back into the settlement services, and then there is a kind of second or poor cousin hierarchy that starts to happen. And this, I think, also is part of what I was saying about the language and the framing. We need to recognise the professionalism, a specialisation that comes with the response that all of us have in relation to the needs of women, children, men out there in our communities. I caution against the rendering, I suppose, or the kind of dialogue that I'm hearing here that suggests that somehow settlement services don't need the specialised training as much as the family violence sector. There's an element of racist discourse that makes me feel very uncomfortable in the way that we start to demarcate, you know, who's a good service and who's not. But I really want to reinforce that final point, Nicola, about let's not forget that ultimately to truly respond in a way that women and children are asking us to do, then that needs to come from a place that locates safety as the absolute primary consideration. And part of that safety is an understanding of what cultural safety might look like as well. Juliana, I don't know if you want to make a couple of comments. Nicola, I'm taking over your job here. I've always been interested in your job, Nicola.
Should give it a whirl.
Yeah, well, thank you, Maria. That was excellent. I think I just have a couple of things to add there. Totally 100% we agree that there needs to be funding injected into settlement services for settlement service providers to be able to deal effectively with domestic and family violence. Our staff are stretched to the limit dealing with settlement service issues, and yet our clients continue to return. Even when they refer them on to the specialist DV services, they continue to return to them. In order for our case managers to be adequately confident in providing effective service to our clients, there needs to be funding injected into the system. We couldn't say it any more than that. The other part of it is that our staff are bilingual, bicultural. And it's very interesting how we are very comfortable in Australia in just being comfortable about we have bilingual, bicultural workers, which means what? You should realize that bilingual, bicultural workers are very effective in service delivery. However, we can't leave them at the level of an entry level without professionalizing their roles and investing in their professional development in order that they become adequate in their service provision towards the clients that they get. So these are the two things that I will add to Maria's argument. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. We have some questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to start to throw some of them out. One person in the audience was speaking about issues in regional and remote communities, and she spoke of a situation where they were assisting a woman access an AVO, and when the interpreter called, it was actually her own husband. Does the panel have any advice for how services can support migrant and refugee women in regional and remote areas in culturally responsive and safe ways? Juliana, you can respond to that if you like.
Really, I think it's more than only the regional and areas. It's also about smaller communities. Because when you talk about interpreters, we're looking at especially people who are in smaller communities, and it's often that the people who are in those communities are known to everybody. So the interpreter tends to know everybody. And you know what? We actually give a lot of power to those interpreters. What can be done, what we often require that they call out into the translators and interpreter services and insist on the people being NATI accredited. Of course, they are NATI accredited. But what do you do when that person happens to be your perpetrator? That is a very difficult place to judge. That is why we are asking for increase in the services, increase in professionalism of our settlement workers, so that our bilingual, bicultural workers are confident and don't need to necessarily resort to the use of interpreters in that situation.
I'd just add, I'm just wondering, so if I understand it correctly, you're saying the interpreter was actually the perpetrator. So I'm wondering if we have any sort of screening system, because that's very alarming for a survivor who's developed the confidence to talk about a matter and then suddenly faced with her perpetrator being aware of her talking about it. So yeah, I would hope there's some way that we could filter that through and make sure it didn't happen.
I really want to encourage people, if they do identify that there is a problem in the use of interpreters, or where the interpreter might indeed be an alleged perpetrator, that it's reported. And NATI has done a lot of work on actually developing some effective policies and practices indeed worked quite closely with Lifeline on a recent package on working with interpreters in family and domestic violence. So I just want to encourage anyone who experiences any challenges in working with interpreters and believes there might be some sort of unethical or potentially illegal behaviour, please make the complaint. If they don't know what's happening, we can't do anything about it.
We've had another question come in that relates to the recent federal government budget. They announced some changes in relation to domestic violence and partner visas. And we did hear the Attorney General talk tonight about the issues that people on temporary visas face. And it's great that he's putting the pressure on the federal government in this area. There were two measures, and the question for the panel is whether they think these measures will be effective. The first is that someone from overseas will be told if the proposed partner has a history of violence, the sponsoring partner has a history of violence as revealed through a police check. And the second is that a reasonable command of English is supposedly also going to somehow reduce domestic violence. What does our panel think of these measures, and what else needs to happen to help people on temporary visas?
I think that was my question, Nicola. I want to go straight to the point. The first question is, we should tell people who are coming in as sponsored under partner visas about the history of domestic violence of their partners. If we're going to isolate the migrants, non-English speaking background migrants for this, then that's pretty problematic. I think it's important that if we're going to tell partners, that we ensure that we tell all partners. There is no isolation of who we should tell and who we should not tell. Because once you begin to other groups, then you begin to buy into the whole process of victimization. You increase the victimization. Not only do you increase the victimization, you're beginning to approach it from an implicit bias angle, and also the issue of stereotyping and putting a group of people in a very difficult situation. Already, people who come with spousal visas who are called background are in a very difficult situation. You don't want to increase that. That's the first one. The second one about English language is laughable, seriously, because the point of the matter is, what has functional English got to do with safety of a person who is undergoing domestic and family violence? When we know that already in our system, there are people who are born English and who speak English very well, who still have barriers in reporting domestic and family violence. So I think that action is an added problem that we are putting on top of victims who are themselves unable to report domestic violence. So I say to you, what has English got to do with it, really? And that we should look at the barriers that are faced for reporting domestic and family violence as systemic and complex. And let me give a chance to other people to report.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that because I've been working in this area for quite some time. I'll address those two specific points shortly, but one of the things that I worked on with the federal government was those Departmental Social Services checklists. So I think one thing that's really important from an awareness and an education point of view is that people who are migrating here get some education and information about what domestic and family violence is, because I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, they may be, not saying they necessarily are, but they may be coming from countries where domestic violence is not even criminalised, or there's no problem. It's not known as a concept that is not approved. So having those sort of fact sheets, making sure that new arrivals are given that sort of information is something that's already been implemented by the federal government, including, for example, culturally specific issues such as dowry abuse, what is dowry abuse, etc. But in terms of the sponsoring partner and then the person they're sponsoring being allowed to have information about their past history of violence, I think that's a really important step. There is also already sort of a partial block. If a person has sponsored a person in the past, there can be restrictions on sponsoring another person. But this specific provision of information to the person that may be being sponsored by a person who's had a history of violence. I think that's pretty important, so they can come with a more informed view of what's happening. I mean, often there are cases that we hear of where women have come here and they find out that their partner had already had some sort of a fraudulent marriage, or they had domestic or family violence history, but they were not aware of it. So it is important for families to be aware of that. The English language requirement, look, I mean, I think across the board, I always encourage everyone, to attend English language classes and to be fluent in English. But I do hear the point that it's not something that necessarily occurs because someone doesn't speak good English. I guess the rationale behind bringing in something like that is that maybe they'll understand our laws and our systems better, and they'll be able to maybe even access justice and get help better. But it's something that would have to be really researched and thought through. I think if that's one of the sort of steps that's being brought in as addressing domestic and family violence as a preventative measure.
Can I build on that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly.
So in a way that perhaps challenges what's just been said, and I'm in agreement with Juliana that in relation to this presumption that we sometimes have that somehow English proficiency equates to better character or a better ability to understand the morality behind some of these discussions. I think we need to be firm in challenging that and rejecting that notion, because I mean, just speaking to it from my own experiences, my father was a model migrant, an interpreter with a double master's in linguistics, proficient in English, understood law and politics inside out. And I think sometimes we have to rupture the stereotypes that we have about what types of men have a propensity towards exercising coercive control over their partners, towards violence, and towards a desire for that type of power. So for me, it's really important to resist falling into the belief that somehow that is a solution or a measure that will allow us to identify safer people, because there is there are a lot of stereotypes that feed into the way that broader society thinks about violence, and also into the way that women perceive their own partners when they meet them or enter into a marriage with them, believing that, oh, this looks like a good person from the outside. We need to focus, I believe, on the deeper underlying drivers, which are the power and control dynamic, and the barriers that then prevent women from accessing support and establishing a level of independence that allows them to pursue support in an ongoing way and support that works for them. So I think the biggest things for migrant women, and seeing what steps actually empowered my mother and what was available in her environment that actually allowed her to establish a career and financial independence, are things like access to free community childcare, access to community college and courses through TAFE and things like that, which a lot of migrant women are prevented from accessing because they don't yet have the ability to access support. And if you can't pay for someone to look after your child and you can't leave them with your partner, then you're really stuck in terms of how you build on your skills and seek a job and things like that. So for me, the focus needs to always channel into addressing those barriers, rather than assuming that we can pick out the bad men before they even, get here.
And that's my concern too.
Can I just respond to that? Sorry, because I just want to make sure, Amani, you realise we're actually on the same page. When I first gave my 2-minute spiel, I actually said that domestic or family violence, we need to be very aware that it occurs irrespective of age, gender, socioeconomic background, and in that I'd also include English fluency. All I was saying was I was explaining what might be the rationale. I'm not saying I agree with it. I just think it's always important to play the devil's advocate and give, an explanation as to why they may be talking about bringing this in. But I mean, I actually have raised with the federal minister directly that if you're talking about bringing in these sort of requirements on partner visas, then why are there some other visas that they're not bringing in these English requirements on? So, that's already something I've been sort of raising at the highest level in a public forum. And I really appreciate your firsthand experience I think your points are very salient about the fact that women need to have access to better childcare so that they can get out there and be self-sufficient and be able to then sort of have some greater degree of economic independence, because that is something that some migrant women I've observed have experienced when they come here, that there's the visa power imbalance, that they can be, you know, threatened by their husband, that they'll be thrown back to the country they came from. Also, they're not working here. But
definitely, all of these issues are so complex and nuanced. So yeah.
And I guess I was just wanting to add, Nicola, that, you know, and I think all of these discussions around possible ways forward or solutions are really important. But, you know, sometimes it feels like a bit of a smokescreen to me, because the migration regulations, you know, we've been talking about for years and years. There are, you know, obviously the exception, the spousal exception is a really important one. But let's not forget there are some women out there on temporary visas who can't even access Medicare. There are some more fundamental questions and discussions here about the visa regulations that I think, you know, I would hope we need to clarify as a matter of urgency. I just worry about the extent to which we go down a rabbit hole with all these little ad hoc bits and pieces when there are some fundamental issues that need to be addressed and have to be addressed. Yep.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to everyone who's sent in questions to all of us. Sadly, we are out of time, but it's been absolutely fascinating to hear everything that you have to say. So thank you to everyone. And I'm now going to hand back to Astrid.
Unmute, Astrid.
Astrid, are you there?
Unmute. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm there. I've just went on this big rant about what an amazing discussion it has been and realized that nobody's heard it. It's been very stimulating, and thank you very much for all the panelists for making your time. I know you didn't get to make all your points, and we haven't been able to take as many questions as we wanted, but you can see everybody is just incredibly passionate. And the chat has been very active, so I can see there's lots of tips in the chat as well, and lots of questions that other people have answered. So truly interactive. Thank you very much. We should have Trish Doyle now, who hopefully has been able to get some of the conversation. Trish Doyle is our Shadow Minister for Women and the Prevention of Violence, and also the Shadow Minister for Emergency Services. Trish, do we have you?
Yeah, hi there, Astrid, and hello, everyone. I'm here. I've actually been looking at all of your faces and listening with great interest, some fantastic commentary in this forum. And then from time to time, I turn my head up and have a look at the screen on the wall, because as we hold this forum, there is actually domestic violence legislation being debated in the upper house in the New South Wales Parliament. So as the Shadow Minister, I will need to go down into the chamber and confer with my colleagues about some amendments to that. But first of all, I want to say thank you so much. Thank you so much to Settlement Services International for asking me to come along. I am always open to hearing a range of views and ideas and experiences. It's great to see some familiar faces. I think about listening to you, Amani, when we first met. It feels like it was years ago, but I think it was only just this last year. And also from a research perspective, which we also need to feed into all the work that we're doing, Heather. Thanks also for covering off some of the work you do. What a fantastic panel, and moderated by Nicola. I just want to touch on that. It is so important, Nicola, that the voice and the tone of the voice that we hear in the media around domestic family voices, someone who gives validity and appreciates the intelligence behind the arguments that need to be said in this space, that media voice is so incredibly important. So thank you for the work that you do. It's really appreciated. I just wanted to quickly say, I am the member for the Blue Mountains. I acknowledge NAIDOC Week. I acknowledge that I am on in Eora Nation, but I represent very proudly the people, the First Nations people of the Darug and Gundungurra. I am in the New South Wales Parliament. I've had the craziest week you wouldn't believe, a couple of pieces of big legislation. So I'm quite tired. I left here at 2 a.m. this morning after speaking amendments into the House. I never expected to be in this place, can I just tell you. Anyone who has heard my inaugural speech or has heard about it might know that I am the little girl who came from a poverty-stricken home riddled with domestic violence. Many times over, I was the little girl who thought that I was going to die trying to protect my mum and my brothers and sisters. Prevention of domestic violence, raising awareness of gender inequality has been my lifelong work. So I feel incredibly privileged. I never imagined that I would be walking through the doors of Parliament. And when a bunch of men did tell me that my hair was too messy and I was too loud and too rough around the edges and I didn't fit the image of a politician, well, I said to them, watch me. So here I am. My leader asked me to be the shadow minister in this space. I think my job is holding the government to account. I think my job is to make sure that I take your voices, your authentic stories, your requests into the Parliament and ask for what we need. Now, you heard from the Minister, he's a really nice guy. He's not combative like many politicians, but he does come from a neoliberal government that is more penny pinching than spending money. And as we have this great discussion with 2 bills on the table around coercive control and a discussion paper, and I'm proudly the Deputy Chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Coercive Control, I will be pushing hard that we can talk the talk, but until we walk the talk, unless we attach money and priorities to education, training, across the sector, pump money into the sector, legislation doesn't mean anything. So that's what I'll be arguing. I'm really appreciative of the efforts that so many people have taken tonight to talk to what is experienced by culturally diverse communities, by migrant refugee women. And I think Maria was spot on. Safety has to be the key focus. And I'd like to just thank everyone who has sent in comments and questions. What an incredible forum, especially Malenka, who says that services are operating on 2010 funding levels and it's 2020. So that's what I'm going to keep sheeting home to the Minister, although I do respect him. Where's the money, Minister? There is an irony as well in the policies that are put forward. Staying home, leaving violence, and then stripping the women's refuge movement of places for women to go. We have to keep reminding these people that they must actually stump up money. I want to acknowledge all of our peak organisations. I know my colleague Hayley Foster is here tonight and the good work they do advocating to government. But equally important is all those who work on the front line, those who study in this space. And I call it the front line because I make that association with war. It can often feel like that. It often looks like that. Services and individuals are working not at capacity, they're working beyond capacity. And I think it's really important that parliamentarians, decision makers in this place acknowledge that. So thank you to all of the workers in this space. There is a shortage of affordable housing, emergency housing, transitional housing, and that's what I'll be prosecuting in the next little while. So thank you for having me. It's been a great forum. I hope to be involved and engaged in more of these. Please, if there's anything you feel that I need to stand up while I've got captive audiences of premiers, treasurers, ministers, find my email, send me through comments, and I'm happy to stand up. That's what I'm known for, being a bit loud. So I need to head down into the chamber soon to talk about amendments to this stronger communities legislation on domestic violence and make sure that the government hears some of those necessary points around what we need to change in our justice system. So thanks.
Thank you, Trish. Thanks very much. And can I say you're right on the money with asking for money? Absolutely. Always the sector is very stretched, both the multicultural and the domestic violence sectors, absolutely. So in summing up, I just want to quickly say what I heard in all this, and certainly the specialization and coordination across the two sectors are really important and absolutely recognized. The veiled racism we sometimes see in public policy, the need to address the barriers and include shame in that thinking, but also address the barriers from a service perspective. The importance of language and how we can frame things in a way that is not finger pointing, but that allows us to talk about evidence and allows us to make strong arguments. And most of all, the people that are most affected in the front line with a lack of income and lack of choices to actually accessing services in the first place, the temporary visa holders. That is a failure of government in the current environment. That's not, and I think that has to be recognized, that is something of the most urgent things we need to address. But let me say thank you to everyone in a few minutes that we have. So I thank the wonderful suite of speakers we had. You made this evening special. Thank you. Violet Rumiliotis, Minister Speakman, Trish Doyle, Nicola Berkovic, Maria Dimopoulos, Heather Nankaro, Pallavi Sinha, Amani Haider, and Juliana Nkrumah. You've all been absolutely fabulous. In the background, though, we also were fielding questions, and the panel, Jessica Harkins and Magdalene Shenton Kalado, were sitting in the background trying to kind of collate your questions. And I've just heard that you will get our emails, and we will do our best to respond to some of the questions after. They did a fabulous job, absolutely. We also want to thank a huge thank you to our communications team, most of all Greg Glenner and Serena Shu. They worked tirelessly to make this event happen. It's complex these days. I hope you, as the audience, you found the webinar as stimulating as I have. There's much to discuss in the future, and we certainly look forward to an ongoing dialogue with the domestic and family violence sector. So I would like to thank you from far and near, and I have to say thank you for being engaged and make the time so late in the day. I know that's very difficult. It's a time where many of us prepare the kids for bed, but we've had a very large audience, so we're very, very grateful to you. And as flagged earlier, this has been hosted in terms of the webinar technology by Australia at Home, and we'd like to thank them too. Australia at Home is designed to be a meeting place for civil society in Australia and to equip all of us to keep making a positive impact in solidarity with one another throughout this time. So to support each other, cheer each other on, and share ideas. But from here, from SSI, I want to say let's keep the conversations going and have an insightful NAIDOC week as well. It is still NAIDOC week right till Sunday. Good night, everyone.